Welcome back to Full Proof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. It's good to be with you here today. We're going to have a great conversation with John Whitehead about a recent decision the IRS made regarding the Johnson Amendment. If you don't know anything about that, it is an excuse pastors have used for many years now to avoid talking about politics in the pulpit. So John is going to let us in on what happened recently with the Johnson Amendment. John is a lawyer and a faithful Baptist man, and so I'm excited to have a great conversation with him. Before we get into today's episode, I want to make sure you knew about my website, jchasedavis.com. I just refreshed it, updated it. I'm publishing articles over there and updates and links and all that's over there. You can read articles on church planting, ministry, Christian discipleship and formation, other things related to culture. So jchasedavis.com is where you need to go. You can also support the show either over at jchasedavis.com or go to the Patreon, which is linked in the show notes. I wanted to make sure you knew about a great partner of the program, Farmer Bill Provisions. Go to farmerbillsprovisions.com. That's farmerbillsprovisions.com. What they do over there is they sell beef jerky, but it's not beef jerky. It's biltong, and it's a great product you can use on a regular basis to up your protein intake. You always need to be consuming more protein. Most Americans do not consume enough protein. They're eating seed oils and other nasty stuff. Farmer Bills will have none of that. All of his stuff is very natural, American-made product. You can use code FULLPROOF, that's FULLPROOF, FULLPROOF, one word, for 20% off your order at farmerbillsprovisions.com. Another partner of the program is Legacy Profits Club. Legacy Profits Club helps you learn the skills you need to make money in the stock market. If you get involved in the stock market, it can be really intimidating if you don't know what you're doing, like someone like me, where I buy stock in Wendy's because I go there and buy cheeseburgers. Instead, go to Legacy Profits Club, learn from Derek, and he will give you one-on-one coaching and instruction to make sure you're not throwing your money away like yours truly, and you can actually make money in the stock market. It's a great way to become anti-fragile. Head over to the link in my show notes, sign up for Derek's courses over at Legacy Profits Club, and he will help you get started in trading. Last thing I wanted to let you know about is Ion Layer. You've probably heard about it on the program before, but Ion Layer is a great way to boost your NAD plus levels. It's kind of a form of biohacking. I'm actually going to address biohacking in my upcoming book, hopefully coming out in the next 6 months, so you can be looking forward to that. But NAD plus is a great way to boost Ion Layer is a great way to boost your NAD plus levels, and you can use code FPT to get $100 off your first kit. These kits are a fraction of the cost of going to a health wellness center where you'd get an IV drip for NAD plus. Instead, go over to ionlayer.com, use code FPT, and get $100 off your first kit. All right, let's get into today's conversation with John Whitehead. John is a lawyer, wrote an article over at the Center for Baptist Leadership, and so I'm excited to bring him on to share kind of some of his wisdom and insight onto this matter. So, John, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, good to be here, Chase. Thanks for having me.
For the audience who might not be familiar with your work, you've done some podcasts over at the Center for Baptist Leadership. You've been involved with SBC Life for a while. Maybe give the audience a little bit of background into who John Whitehead is.
So John Whitehead lives just outside Kansas City. I'm married and have 5 kids here, and so my practice. I graduated from Southwest Baptist University and then went to Harvard Law School and came back here. And have been in practice now almost 20, just over 20 years. And so most of that has been representing either churches or religious groups when the government interferes. And so we handled cases like the Trinity Lutheran case along with our friends at ADF and Carson versus Maine involving student tuition with our friends at IJ and First Liberty. And so that's been a big part, or defending religious people against discrimination or when they've been harmed. So that's a major portion of my practice.
That's excellent. Well, thank you so much for your work on that. I know that's really important. Here in Colorado, we're always, looking around to see, hey, who are Christian lawyers that are willing to partner with us? And thank God for legal centers like the ADF and others who are doing great work out there. So I really appreciate the work you've done. You wrote this article for the Center for Baptist Leadership, talk about the Johnson Amendment. I think a lot of Christians, when they think about church and politics, maybe they're like me. Maybe they grew up in kind of a maybe more conservative Southern Baptist church, and it was a little confusing at times, like how we should think about church and state. Maybe they had a 4th of July service recently or Memorial Day or something like that, but there's not a lot of education on it. There's not a lot of helping people understand what it looks like for churches to get involved politically. When churches do get involved politically, it's often used to smear all the rest of the churches that even try to get involved politically. So you'll see this movement in the United States called NAR or other movements that are very kind of Trumpian, more of a charismatic bent. But to me, I'm thinking just more evangelical churches. My context in Colorado, a lot of them use uh, kind of legal matters like the Johnson Amendment, which we're going to get into, to kind of shirk away. And so I want to get to that at the end of the episode, but it's important for us to understand what just happened on July 7th. In order to do that, I want to hear from you what the Johnson Amendment is, what it was, what it was created for, what it came to be before July 7th.
Yeah, so the Johnson Amendment is named after what most of us know as President Johnson, but it was then Senator Johnson, Lyndon Johnson in Texas. And it was during a major revamp of the tax code. And some of you will have read Robert Caro's book, Master of the Senate. Johnson was kind of the ringleader in the Senate. Um, and and there's really some fuzzy history as to how it came to be. Johnson just kind of put it in without much notice, and it passed through the Senate. But the provision says that no charity can interfere in or engage in electoral politics. And so that then becomes, in effect, an additional condition on what we would call charities, but under the tax code, those are classed under Section 501c3. And so 501c3 is just the lump of all charities, whether those are secular charities or whether those are religious charities, including churches. And so some folks say, am I a 501c3? Yes. If you're operating like a church, the federal government would classify you for tax purposes under 501c3. And so this became kind of a condition for keeping your tax exemption. Why was it put in? Well, there's not a lot of good evidence about why it was put in. It just kind of seemed to sail through. I've heard people say, well, maybe Johnson was criticized by pastors in his district and was offended by that. So it's not clear if it was retribution or if it was he just thought it was a good idea. But the Johnson Amendment goes in relatively unopposed in the tax code rewrite of 1954. And so really, that's a good 20 years older than me, almost 25. And so for all of my life, that has been the backstop to that argument. Should pastors address politics? And here's prudential reasons, yes and no. But then ultimately, you don't want to risk your church's tax exemption by getting into these areas. And so that's how it came to be and how it then becomes the backstop for those arguments.
Yeah, and we even saw that in our work in Colorado with House Bill 251312. There was a lot of accusations, concern from Christian leaders, but mainly from leftists who are like, "We need to report them," and I don't know what they would report us for. We were just preaching the gospel to the state capitol, very permissible speech. Weren't endorsing, just talking about a bill, and maybe that was a violation of the Johnson Amendment before July 7th. I don't know, but to us, it was just speaking biblical ethics to a very important cultural matter. Kind of give me some insight. Did that often get enforced? Because I think one of the things that I've seen go around on this topic is like, for the Black church, they've been very outspoken, involved in politics. They haven't shirked away from it. And yet for majority white churches, it's often used, like you said, out of a fear of losing their 501c3. So was the Johnson Amendment something that was enforced pretty harshly? Did it differ by who was president? Do you have any insight into that?
Well, so let me hit one thing you just talked about, which was even in debates about legislation, the Johnson Amendment gets kind of trotted out as maybe potentially a violation or a principle to think about. And to be clear, the IRS for a long time has been clear, and the statute itself says it's electoral politics, not just something everyone votes on. So it really has to involve a candidate for office. So you can talk. The rule had always been you can talk about issues in legislation. You're not supposed to endorse a particular candidate. So there was always that freedom technically under the statute. But as I mentioned, pastors were always unclear about it, and so it got trotted out as well. You can't talk about politics at all. And so whether it's in your situation, Colorado, I had pastor friends, even if I've written a little explainer for 20 years before election season. You can talk about issues, you can't talk about candidates. That's the rule. But then big, clear biblical issues, like your bill in Colorado or in Missouri, where pro-abortion forces were trying to enshrine a right to abortion in Missouri's constitution that had never been there before. No candidate on the ballot. The only question is, should Missouri enshrine a right to abortion in its constitution? And it was heartbreaking that pastors that knew me, that I read my little explainers for years, said, but now we're not supposed to talk about this from the pulpit, right? Because that would violate the Johnson Amendment, and we don't want to risk our tax exemption. So the fuzziness of the language ended up chilling more speech than if they had dragged anybody out in particular and punished them. In some ways, making the rule unclear almost was worse than what they did. Moving on, you asked about enforcement. It was enforced very rarely. And in fact, it was. I told somebody it was more honored in the breach. It's a rule we kept, but almost nobody enforced. There were a handful of cases where the IRS went all the way and removed tax exemptions, or actually fined somebody, and it was upheld in court. So there was maybe a couple of churches that bought ads in their newspaper, and the IRS said that's clearly a violation, and we'll go ahead and take your tax exemption. I know a pastor, Gary Hamrick, said it was improper to vote for Democrats, and the IRS in recent years fined him. Didn't take away the tax exemption, so they kind of used lesser penalties then. The typical way it came up was, though, like you mentioned, there were atheist groups or church state groups that would threaten pastors they thought had crossed the line. And so you get this nasty gram from somebody that says your tax exemption is at risk, and we're asking the IRS to investigate you. But as we've said, the IRS didn't investigate a lot of these. In fact, Alliance Defending Freedom for a couple of years, when they were headed by Mike Ferris, had a pulpit freedom project, and they encouraged churches pastors, if they were willing or thought it was appropriate, to endorse a candidate, and then in their Sunday sermons, and then ADF would send the sermons into the IRS and ask to be investigated. And they had maybe, I think they said 35 churches the first year, and maybe a couple hundred in a year after that. And the IRS never opened an investigation. So it's clear the IRS thought the bark was worse than the bite in some cases, but that was what was desired. It had the effect, as you mentioned, especially after the civil rights movement, which was so closely connected to religious leaders. I'm not sure if the consensus changed. I think maybe at the time in the 50s, it's the height of civil religion, and it's the height of In God We Trust, and it's the Eisenhower administration's in place, and so maybe it was the consensus that, well, everybody's Christian enough that we don't need to talk about these issues. But certainly after the civil rights movement among Democrats, and then after the pro-life movement amongst conservatives, I think there was a consensus change. Well, there can be issues in our politics that do involve clear religious matters, and there can be candidates that clearly stand for or against clear biblical teaching. And so it ended up that both sides, in essence, had some skin in the game in wanting pastors to be able to address issues, and that explains probably the lack of enforcement. But Mike Ferris did say, the record was pretty clear that if it was enforced, it tended to be enforced against conservative, or what they would have thought of as Republican churches. So the examples we have are biblical Christian conservative churches, not those churches on the left. And during election season, you see the video from candidates being given pulpits to stand up that clearly violated the Johnson Amendment. But again, if there was enforcement, it was rare, but it tended to be against conservatives.
Okay, that makes sense. So then July 7th, I didn't even know this was on the docket. I didn't know, I don't know where this ruling was made. I guess it was in IRS guidance and policy. I'm not sure. I had some lawyer friends from the church read over it, and they were kind of nerding out over it, which was fun. But tell me what happened on July 7th. What was the court filing, and what is now changed in regards to the Johnson Amendment?
Yeah, so this was kind of the project of Mike Ferris after he left ADF, and is now at National Religious Broadcasters. And they found two churches in Texas that were willing to stand up and challenge the rule and say, we want to preach a sermon. They hadn't violated it already, but they told the judge, we would like to talk about these issues from our pulpit, and we think the Johnson Amendment interferes with our First Amendment religious liberty. So they brought a case in Texas, in a district court in Texas, and they engaged in discovery. They brought it actually during the Biden administration, if I recall correctly. So it's been a couple years in the courts pending, and there's been litigation and discovery. And in essence, the IRS has admitted the case is clear enough after the discovery that's been done and the First Amendment principles and precedents the Supreme Court has laid down. The case is clear that we can never really enforce the Johnson Amendment when pastors are preaching in the pulpit to their members. That communication is so clearly protected by the First Amendment. We're going to go ahead and consent to a judgment. The court can enter the judgment, but we agree it's the right statement of the rule, says the IRS and the churches, that the Johnson Amendment cannot reach pulpit speech while it's being communicated to members in the normal channels. So that area is off limits from a political burden. You can't yank somebody's tax exemption merely because of the religious views they express during their sermons, even if that's about candidates and elections.
Okay, so then what remains? Is there anything that's still off limits in terms of the Johnson Amendment for churches? I can, because it seems to me, I mean, this is very exciting for many people. This is a huge win for a guy like Mike who's been working on this. And for this kind of chilling of speech you've seen, obviously a huge win, but is there anything that remains off limits for churches, pastors, 501c3s to engage in?
Yeah, there will always be edge cases. I think this probably resolves the big issue that would affect most churches during their life, which is, what can my pastor say from the pulpit? Is it okay to let people know how I'm thinking about these issues as a part of the application of biblical teaching to our life together? I think that probably solves the big issue for 90% of churches. There will always be edge cases, right? There's always going to be some political consultant that would like a church to not just be a church, but to work on its behalf. And so the consent decree just applies to preaching on Sunday or preaching during services, religious services, to members, and then the normal channels you would use to do that. So if you're going to put it on Facebook or stream it on the internet, those are normal means. And just because somebody outside the church sees the service, that's not going to apply there. That doesn't mean that a candidate can give you money to endorse them, or that outside political consultants, right, can take over your church budget and use you as, in essence, as a front for the campaign. That's still not allowable. Your church still can't donate to campaigns without raising serious questions about, is this really a church, or is this a political organization using the name church? So there will be some edge cases that still get involved. You probably can't use billboards still, right? And so the situation where you're going to take out an ad in the local newspaper and say this church endorses so and so as a candidate, at least raises questions. You still have to have it still needs to be an insubstantial part of your overall activities. Your lobbying activities still need to be an insubstantial part. And as I've told churches, there are 52 weeks in a year. You probably shouldn't spend more than a week full time on some political campaign. After that, that would look suspicious. But I've never run across that church. I've never run across the church that has spent full time 2 or 3 weeks on a political issue because they're church. They're ministering to people. They're helping people. They're doing Sunday school and Bible studies. So for most churches, the edge cases really won't apply. There will be some edge cases. Is my money speech? Can we donate to candidates? Can we buy the ads, or can we put a sign out in the church property? All those remain edge cases, that I don't think most churches will run into. What should be clear is that pastors in their pulpits have freedom to speak, and that's the freedom most churches have desired. We'll judge the edge cases case by case basis as people have issues that arise.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, there has been I've seen a few churches in other parts of the country that have been whether they're leaders on their individual time, I don't think the organization have helped start PACs or I believe they're 501c4s, I believe
Right,
is what they are.
right.
And that's permissible, I believe. Is that true?
Yeah, as long as it's the individuals participating, right? Just being a pastor or just being a member of a church doesn't circumscribe your personal political activity. The issue here was really is as the are we using the charitable money to advance political interests as opposed to the ministry of the church? And as we've said, there can be close calls, but the clearest area needs to be when you're speaking to your members during religious services. That's not uh, activity in a political campaign. That is clearly the ministry of the church. So, is this a church thing or a political thing? It's a church thing when you're talking to your members about how to apply politics or apply biblical principles to everyday politics.
Yeah, and this is just so helpful and clarifying because it opens up, uh, well, as I see it, it opens up a lot of questions and it reveals a lot of ignorance on the part of everyday Christians who get confused on these matters. I don't think it needs to be confusing. The church has their job. Um, one thing that I've noticed, and I don't know if you've seen this in Missouri, with some pastors, it seems that when they graduated from seminary, it's as if they turned in their citizenship. It's like they turned in their passport and said, I'm no longer a citizen of any kingdom on this earth. I am only a citizen of the kingdom of God. And therefore, I don't talk about anything as it pertains to our national identity or voting or politics. Um, and that's been frustrating for me because I'm like, you're still a man. Like you still have a body, you still have a family, you have responsibilities, you pay taxes, or even if you filed an exemption, or you have housing allowance or parsonage, whatever, you're still involved in politics. Have you seen that be an issue from your vantage point?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there is. As I told somebody, I think the law, the fact that that legal pressure was just kind of floating around in the background, created really bad habits about how to think about politics. And once something's been the law 50 or 60 years, people just kind of invent justifications. Well, I wasn't going to need to do that anyways. And here's how I was going to get around it. We all like to think we're clever enough to get around the law. And so sometimes we hear pastors say, well, I would get around that by preaching about issues, but never saying this about candidates. Um, and, and on the one hand, fine if that's the way you want to live your life. But on the other hand, I don't think you should have to alter your conduct in the pulpit uh, in order to accommodate the government's beliefs, right? In the same way when we talk about housing allowance, I've run across pastors who say, "Well, I'll tell the IRS whatever they've been ordained or whatever it is, even if they're really not a real pastor." And well, no, let's not tell the IRS or the world that we believe something as a biblical principle, such as, well, the Bible says to not endorse candidates. No, the Bible doesn't say that. There were no candidates in Rome. They didn't really have a reason to confront it. But but the ultimate principle is we are, when you're acting as a church, you are reflecting ultimate scriptural realities, right? So the scripture is most important. The scripture is eternal, and politics is temporal, just about the here and now. And so we never want to distract from the ultimate reality. We never want to distract from the weightiness of Scripture. We don't want to mix up our words and what God has said, right? If so, I understand if you've taken on the pastorate, you want to be sure you're giving weight as a messenger of what God has said, and you don't want to unnecessarily ball that up with what the preacher thinks on his own, or what individual members think, or a tiny circumstance in your town. Um, so I get that as the overarching principle, but it isn't the case. I don't think that the Bible so clearly says there just can't be a candidate anywhere, anyplace, anytime with positions that don't involve clear biblical teaching. And so the shepherd, as and maybe this is maybe this is a uniquely low church Baptist view, the minister is among the sheep, right? That we're all in this together, and the minister is not above the flock in the sense that they've got some special spiritual view. They are one of us with the special assignment of helping us shepherd, of helping us of being able to do the study full time, to devote themselves to the word, and to help us as a group apply the word to our circumstances. And so that is the role of the shepherd, not to be better than us, or not to have some view that's more holy than the rest of us. You're not more holy than the rest of us. You're among us. And so that kind of shepherd is going to need to tell their sheep, look, there are wolves right over there, or there are major biblical concerns right over there. And so, in a world where that is the shepherd is among the sheep, not standing up on a hill, making hand signals or using a horn or whatever it is. You're down with us. You smell like the sheep. And there are real dangers at that level that need to be explained and talked about.
Yeah, and I've always found it interesting. Pastors are very free about sports teams they root for, food preferences they have, hobbies they enjoy, and they'll defend those, flippantly but vigorously in the pulpit. Some pastors even go so far as to don a sports jersey in the pulpit, which I find to be personally abhorrent. But they do this. They're not afraid of sharing their opinions on a variety of matters. But I think you're right. This chilling effect over the last 50, 60 years has led them to conclude that politics is one off limits, but also potentially so divisive for the congregation that we can't touch that. And that makes me really sad for them because I'm like, you're a human. Like you obviously are willing to share your opinions on a variety of matters as
Right.
either applications, illustrations, whatever it may be. Um, and yet this one seems to be off limits. I wish that more pastors could be more like the sheep in that sense. So to speak, that would be more real and human. Like, hey, this is how I'm thinking about this matter, and that would provide clarity. Hopefully, they're thinking very biblically on these matters, and with wisdom and insight. And that's kind of want to get into next is, you know, it's hard to imagine because this, as we're recording, happened 4 days ago. We're having to undo. It's kind of like it's not a whole new world, but it really shifts the paradigm of what pastors are kind of under the impression of or taught. What's the future look like in this? Because on the one hand, it could feel like the wild wild west where it's like, well, great, we could, and we talked about some of the edge cases already, but what does it look like moving forward? What would you encourage pastors to do moving forward to act in prudence and doing their job well now that this is kind of fair game?
Yeah, I mean, like I've said, I do want churches to care about the eternal things more than the temporal things, right? So that is always the church's first calling, is to demonstrate the things of God, both to the world, but also amongst themselves. And so you could, from John Whitehead's view, spend too much time on politics, right? You could make an endorsement over petty local concerns and not biblical principles, and I don't want that to happen, frankly. Like I said on X, First Baptist Church should probably not normally have a strong opinion about the dog catcher race in its town, right? That's not biblical. That's probably just who's the best dog catcher. And if it happens to be a Methodist, not a Baptist, probably not a reason to divide the town or the community as a matter of God. I also think there's a continuum of application here, right? So where the pastor says, you should know how I'm applying this in my own life. Kind of like they would say, here's how I'm applying biblical principles in my own marriage or to my own child rearing or in my daily life. That I think is so clearly a part and parcel of the normal ministry of the pastorate. That kind of stuff I think will and probably should happen. If it's not in a sermon during your teaching ministry, you're going to have to address that kind of stuff. Again, not to be kind of a far off voice, but in and amongst the sheep. So there's that. At the other end of that spectrum would be things like, well, we're going to kick out all the Democrats or Republicans in our church.
Right.
And I think that kind of stuff, God has said you only vote for Republicans. That's clearly not in the Bible. And so I want, if you're going to argue that the current iteration of the Democrat Party and what the motivations designing it behind it, or even the Republican Party, right? The motivations of the individuals there justify some explanation under biblical principles. That's great. I want to be careful that you don't end up saying, as a matter of prudence, you don't say something that God has not said. So be clear about what God has said, and be clear that this is an application and why it's an application and what makes it important. I think those are the things you probably owe to each other as we make these applications. And again, extend grace, right? I think there are certainly is room to say, well, this person has had a different experience, and here are their concerns, and the church is going to reflect the concerns of your community and those around you. So I would be hesitant to go to the extreme end of saying, well, my politics are now the Bible. But I think it's perfectly natural for pastors to say, here's how I'm thinking and applying my politics as an instruction to the church about practical daily living. And if others in the church express those views as well, that is teaching. That's not involvement in a political campaign. And so that's why I think it's, it was ridiculous that we ever had the rule. It was the aberration, not the tradition. And so it's good to get rid of that portion of this statute.
Yeah, there's I don't know if it's a fine line, but it needs to be talked about. You know, what's going to be difficult for these churches that haven't discussed these matters in the ways that we're talking about, whether it's doing workshops or nights of, where you get together with a pastor and you just talk through the issues. We've done that. Try to offer biblical wisdom. Um, the I think for a lot of churches that have never done anything like that, it's going to be very difficult because I think they're going to try to do it. If they try to do anything, it's going to be perceived as great. Now you're just getting political. And it's like, no, like we're just trying to apply the Bible to all life, like you mentioned with marriage and family. But I've simply since 2020, I mean, one of my earliest episodes on this podcast was talking with a philosopher about kind of what is a vote, what is filling out a ballot. Cause I'm pretty disinterested in binding consciences where the Bible doesn't. In fact, I would say I shouldn't do that. There may be times where, if you had an openly communistic, let's say a guy in New York City who's openly communistic, there may be a time where it's you could apply the Bible to say Christians should not vote for that guy. And let the chips fall where they may. I don't know if you would rise, I believe there might be churches out there that would put somebody under church discipline for voting for that guy. And those are questions that I go back to church history on. Those are questions that I reflect upon, not regularly, but anytime a new electoral cycle comes along. It's like, there are some really strong Christians with conservative views who are like, if you vote Democrat, you should be put under church discipline. I'm not necessarily, I sympathize with that instinct. I'm not necessarily, don't have a great appetite for that, not because I don't believe it's because of cowardice. I'm just more like, I don't know if we're going beyond our scope. You see these ridiculous churches where it's like, if you bought Starbucks, you're participating in homosexuality, and don't bring Starbucks in the sanctuary. We're going to put you under church discipline. I'm like, man, like that's a level of involvement and policing that I'm pretty disinterested in. But at the same time, I don't want those extreme cases to demur a healthy education and a willingness from the pastor to just be, like you said, one of the sheep. I am a man. I have thoughts, and I have been appointed and called with biblical insights. Not necessarily that you can't glean on your own, but I have a job to do, and I can apply those to the political realm and particular candidates. And if you disagree with me, in our day, then that's going to be seen as something we should divide over. I don't think it needs to be. But I've even gone so far, like on my podcast on another episode, I just walked through the issues on the ballot, and I just said, "Hey, here's how I'm voting. Here's why I'm voting this way." It wasn't in a sermon. It wasn't anything like that. And everything from, should we allow a new casino or more casinos in Colorado? And I'm like, no. Should we allow mushrooms? And I've got Christians who think, medicinal mushroom use is totally permissible, and I'm
Yeah.
I'm trying to encourage them. I don't think it is. And so I think we can have these conversations, but for a lot of people, I don't know that they're maybe not capable. They're just not familiar with the language. Do you sense the tension I'm talking about? How would you maybe
Oh
help
yeah.
pastors
Yeah.
work through that?
Yeah. I mean, look, the church has had to, new issues and concerns have arisen continually, and it's not a formal process, but there's a practical process, right? Where we're told to pursue unity, and we want to be unified, and we want to focus on what is eternal, not what doesn't matter. What matters, or there are matters for disagreement. The New Testament tells us that do not stop us from demonstrating love for each other or the eternal principles. But sometimes things come up, whether it's theology issues, whether it's civil government issues, and sometimes it's not pretty. Sometimes, maybe after long discussion and practical application, um, there does have to be a parting of ways. And sometimes that process is slower, right? So I feel like there have been cases when I've seen something clearly and my church hasn't, and it's taken a long time to get a majority to wrap their heads around that issue. Certainly vaccines work that way, right? I mean, there are absolutely people in my church that thought the vaccine is God's gift, and I'm going to rush out and take it as a demonstration of love to my neighbor. I heard that repeatedly, and that's that doesn't affect the way I do church with them normally. But on the other hand, there absolutely were people in my church that said, "I think this is uh, uh, because of the use of aborted fetal cells in those vaccines. I don't think it's an appropriate use of life. I don't want that in my body. I don't want to communicate or take the vaccine because I have a sincere religious objection." And so it's hard enough to have that conversation with those two people. But then there were folks that said, no, if you claim a religious exemption, that's a bad Christian and you shouldn't do that. Right. So you've been bad doing that. And likewise, there are folks on the other side, I'm sure, that said, well, if you take the vaccine, you're a bad Christian and you should be under church discipline. And it's my sense those were hard conversations, but by and large, we got through it, right? Churches did it. How much worse would it have been if there had been a government rule that said, but pastors can't talk about the vaccine? Well,
Right.
that would make things so much worse, right? I mean, it's bad enough we're having the conversation, bad enough that there might really be a need for division through tears and through hard work on certain issues. But then the government had uh, no place in telling us what to talk about. They tried in some cases to tell us how to resolve church conduct issues. Well, your church has to do this or has to wear masks or whatever. And we saw churches respond to that in a lot of different ways. And in hindsight, some of those look worse than others. Some of those look like they were letting the government lead them around by the nose in hindsight. Um, but all that to say, issues are going to come up, and the church has dealt with those. Even as we pursue unity, sometimes things arise that necessitate division, and that's sad but true because humans have different views and different viewpoints. Um, but churches have dealt with it, and likewise in the political arena, if there are in fact politics that threaten clear biblical teaching, I think churches will get over it. It'll take some time. We'll figure out what the current politics is. We'll respond accordingly, but we can't let the government uh, put their thumb on how we have those discussions. Those need to be through the application of biblical principle, through the demonstration of the things of God, and the spirit educated consciences of believers and pastors, not because some bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. said this is what's right for churches to do or talk about.
Yeah, that was a very intense time. I'm really, as I reflect back on it in my own ministry, I'm very thankful for the Lord's providence and putting around us wisdom and a desire for knowledge, and we did try to do our best. A lot of churches in our area took arrows for staying open, and I'm thankful for those because those were bigger churches that took those arrows, and we got to fly under the radar. But I think issues like abortion, marriage, these things are clear, biblical things that we should talk about. And in those cases, we also in Colorado, like you had in Missouri, ours passed the amendment to the Constitution that permitted abortion up till birth. That passed, even though our church was involved in helping people get connected with people who could petition against it and put a petition on the ballot for a right to life. That didn't pass last time. We're still working on that with pro-life groups, but I think with that, it's more kind of cut and dry. If you're a member of this church, particularly a member, if you're a guest or an attender, maybe the rules don't apply as clear cut to you because you're still exploring the Christian faith or haven't chosen to covenant with a church. But if you're a church member and you're voting for things that are clear violations in our either statement of faith or our confession or our church covenant, then that would be grounds for church discipline. I think would that be a fair way to say it, John?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Look, there are lots of different churches, and as much as Baptists get criticized for being schismatic, one blessing of that is there's probably a church for you, right? There are people you can covenant with together, even as we have very different views on sometimes politics or what the right thing is to do. It is a blessing that, look, you can't be thrown out of every church, right? So just because we're having these conversations and just because groups make decisions about how to apply these issues, doesn't mean there'll be people without churches, right? Or there'll be people that can't find a spot. Nor is there there's not a one size fits all rule, right? I mean, the level of candidate concern is going to be very different in, say, rural Missouri or even Colorado or places like that than if you're, like you said, in New York City, right? The political realities, the content of that society, just very different places. So I don't think it's the case that a church in Missouri is going to be talking about elections just the same as a church in New York City. Two different places, because they're different flocks of sheep in different places with different life together. It's up to the pastors in those churches to decide what is appropriate for this flock at this point.
That's great. Well, John, any parting thoughts, words of encouragement before we sign off today?
No, this has been fun. Thanks for the chance to nerd out. This is a very obscure area of the law. Somebody said, my view of the Johnson Amendment is I just heard about it yesterday, talking to me on Twitter. So lots of folks don't know about this. It has had a chilling effect beyond, I think, the narrow area of the law it should have. So it's been fun to talk about.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming on, John.
Yep, good to be here.
Thanks for tuning in today for another episode of Full Proof Theology. I really appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend, like it on YouTube, subscribe to the YouTube channel, share the podcast with somebody, especially a pastor who may have avoided talking about politics. Ask him if he's going to put a big Trump sign in the front yard of his church. That would be a funny conversation starter. Anyways, really appreciate all the support. You can head over to the Patreon, links in the show notes to support me, get some free swag, get early access to episodes, and you can go to jchasedavis.com for all the other resources available there. We'll see you next time.